Welcome to the Reasonable Faith Podcast. We're so glad you're here. Kevin Harris and Dr. William Lane Craig in studio. And it immediately lit up the blogosphere when it came out a few months ago. Bill, Sam Harris, his book, The Moral Landscape. The subtitle is How Science Can Determine Human Values. That ought to get your attention right away. Not only are we looking at Sam Harris's book here, but you have a debate with him coming up scheduled in April.
That's right, Kevin. I'm very excited about this. The University of Notre Dame has invited me to participate in a debate with Sam Harris on April 7th, and we'll be discussing some of these issues pertinent to the foundations of morality in theism or not.
What are your thoughts on the book after looking through it?
Well, it's a very interesting book. What he is arguing against are, on the one hand, those who would ground moral values and duties in God, in some transcendent source, and who therefore think that science is morally neutral. Science cannot make moral judgments. And he acknowledges this to be the majority point of view. In fact, he said this is the received opinion in intelligentsia, that science makes factual statements about what is the case, but science cannot make normative statements about what ought to be the case in a moral sense. So he's arguing against those who would try to ground morality in some transcendent standard or sphere. On the other hand, he's also arguing against those who are relativists and subjectivists and say, therefore, there are no moral values. Moral values are purely subjective. They are just the products of socio-biological evolution, and they could be quite different, and therefore, there are no objective moral values and duties. Against them, Harris wants to affirm a strong moral objectivism, that it really does make sense to talk about the good life or about things that are evil and wrong, and wants to affirm this kind of moral objectivism. And he will attempt to, therefore, take a position where he will ground moral values in science. Science will tell us or furnish us a sort of science of the good and what it means to lead the good life.
It's almost like he wants to rescue what disbelief in God takes away, in a sense, or at least in the minds of many people. Who's he trying to convince here? It's like, okay, we're atheists, we're secularists, we're agnostics, but that doesn't mean we have to be a moral relativist.
I think that's the aim. I think that's the aim. He wants to provide an alternative to the sort of moral nihilism that modernity has been heir to ever since Nietzsche and his declaration of the death of God. And a good many atheists like Russell and Sartre, for example, have said that in the absence of God, there are no objective moral values and duties. Ethics is basically a subjective illusion of human beings. We are primates on this little planet beset with delusions of moral grandeur about our own value and worth. And so it's against that sort of moral nihilism, I think, that Harris is reacting here. He wants to show his fellow atheists that they too can be moral objectivists.
Wow. It's, once again, though, a popular book. I mean, the audience seems to be limited, but Sam Harris's books tend to sell well, and this is what he says in an interview with Amazon. He says that morality must relate at some level to the well-being of conscious creatures.
That's the key.
If there are more or less effective ways for us to seek happiness and to avoid misery in this world, and there clearly are, then there are right and wrong answers to questions of morality.
Oh, man. Okay, see, it's all there, Kevin. It's all packed into that sentence. He equates human well-being with the good. And something that doesn't contribute to human well-being is therefore not good. And so notice the contrast between happiness and misery. And this is given a moral interpretation. So in the book, this is what he says, and I quote, "Questions about values are really questions about the well-being of conscious creatures." He says he wants to develop a science of human flourishing. And my reaction to that is to say, well, wait a minute. Why equate human flourishing with the good? Certainly, I don't have any problem with the idea that science can tell us what contributes to human flourishing, human well-being, just as it can tell us what will contribute to the well-being of corn. If you want to grow corn, then there's a whole agricultural science that will tell you how to produce the healthiest, most productive corn, what contributes to the well-being of corn, or what would contribute to the well-being of a slime mold in the laboratory, the moisture, the temperature, the nutrients that need to be present for the well-being of a slime mold. And similarly, I don't see any reason to think that science couldn't develop a science of human flourishing, what will contribute to the well-being of this primate species, Homo sapiens, on the planet Earth. But on atheism, on naturalism, I see absolutely no reason to invest that with moral value and to equate human well-being with the morally good. And this is the unspoken assumption of the book, which, so far as I can see, he doesn't attempt to justify. What is the moral landscape in Harris's view? Well, this is how he defines the moral landscape. He says the moral landscape is a space of real and potential outcomes whose peaks correspond to heights of potential well-being and whose valleys represent the deepest possible suffering. So that's just a fancy way of saying that the moral landscape is a sort of space which comprises the highs and the lows of human well-being. And the highs are when people really flourish well, and the lows, the troughs, are when people really suffer the most. And so he says the moral landscape is just this sort of graphic display of the highs and the lows of human well-being, and science can develop findings about what will contribute to the highs and the lows of human well-being, to which I would say, well, of course it can, but why think that this is a moral landscape? It seems to me that there is a fundamental assumption here that is being made that what contributes to human well-being is good and what detracts from it is bad. And in a moral sense, I see no reason to think that's true on atheism.
Amazon asked him, are you saying that science can answer such questions? And he says, yes, in principle, human well-being is not a random phenomenon.
Right.
It depends on many factors, ranging from genetics and neurobiology to sociology and economics.
Right.
But clearly there are scientific truths to be known about how we can flourish in this world. Wherever we can act so as to have an impact on the well-being of others, questions of morality apply.
But that's the issue. Do they apply?
Yeah.
Why on atheism think that when questions of the flourishing of the human species arise, that this is a moral question? And here I think Harris gets away with equivocating on moral and non-moral uses of the terms good and bad. For example, he gives himself the analogy that in chess, in the game of chess, there are both objectively good moves and objectively bad moves. And I would certainly agree with that. There are good moves in chess, there are bad moves in chess that are objective. But notice, Kevin, that is not a moral use of the word good. These moves in chess are not evil, or they're not morally praiseworthy. They're good or bad with respect to the goal of winning the game. Similarly, we can say that the landscaper you hired to do your yard did a good job on the landscaping, or he did a bad job. But you don't mean that in a moral sense, that there's an evil job or a morally bad job. Or we'll say that was a good argument, or that's a bad argument. But you're not saying that it's evil or morally good. There are all kinds of uses of the term good and bad, which are non-moral uses. And so
let's contrast moral good with, what would the other be? Logical good?
Well, I think there's a variety. One would be pragmatic goods. I think that very often they're goods with a view towards some goal. For example, if you want to win the chess game, then there are good moves and there are bad moves.
Yeah, no, that would just be a technical good.
It's a sort of pragmatic or consequentialist use of the word, that with respect to this goal, there are things that you should do.
And there wouldn't be a moral dimension to it.
No, it's not a moral dimension at all. Or when you say that that's a good idea, you're not using the word good in a moral sense. Or somebody suggests another idea, you say, no, that's a bad idea. You're not condemning him as having said something morally reprobate. Yeah. So there are clearly lots of ways in which we use these terms that are non-moral. And what Harris will do is he'll equivocate on this by giving examples of human suffering and saying this is a bad life, and examples of human flourishing and saying this is a good life, and then moving from that to saying that these are morally good and bad. And of course, on atheism, that is precisely the question that needs justification, or the position that needs justification. There is no explanation on his view for why human flourishing has the moral dimension of goodness about it.
Interesting. Does he make the leap then between is and ought? What is and what ought to be?
Yes, he does. And he deals with this in the book. He recognizes that the dominant view today is that there is this fact-value divide, and that from what is, as science describes it, you cannot infer what ought to be. But he says that this is illusory in three senses, and here's his three arguments as to why this is an illusory distinction. First, he says, whatever can be known about maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures must translate into facts about brains. So the flourishing of conscious creatures will translate into facts about brains. Well, whether that's true or not, that's irrelevant. That says nothing about the moral quality of why the flourishing of conscious creatures has this moral property of goodness attached to it. Secondly, says the very idea of objective knowledge has values built into it. For example, you must value logical consistency, reliance on evidence, and so forth. So when you say you have objective knowledge, you are making statements that have certain norms applied to them. Well, this, again, I think, is a good use or good example of this equivocation between moral and non-moral uses of the good. It's good to be logically consistent, but you don't mean that in an ethical sense. The person who is logically inconsistent isn't evil as a result of being inconsistent. Someone who fails to rely on the evidence is using a bad argument, but that doesn't mean he's doing something morally wrong. So he's again equivocating on these different uses of the term. And then thirdly, he says beliefs about facts and beliefs about values arise from similar processes in the brain. Well, again, that's just irrelevant. It may be the same portions of the brain, the same neural firings that bring about beliefs about facts and beliefs about values, fine, but that doesn't do anything to show that facts about what contributes to human flourishing are therefore moral facts, that this is something that is normative. So it seems to me that he has just failed to give any justification for equating the flourishing of conscious creatures with the moral good. And in fact, he says on page 12 that we should define the good as that which supports the well-being of conscious creatures. You just define it that way. And therefore, he says it makes no sense to ask whether maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures is good. It makes no sense because that's the way you've defined it. It's just stipulated.
So you define it into existence.
Yeah, you just define the flourishing of conscious creatures as the good, and then it makes no sense to ask, well, why is the flourishing of conscious creatures good?
Right.
Because you've just defined it that way.
Okay. So he sees that as the stopping point then, as the end.
Yeah. And I would argue, as I have in my published work, that is simply a sort of stubborn humanism, which is premature. It is arbitrary and lacks any kind of explanatory power.
Man is the measure.
Yes, or at least conscious beings are the measure.
Yeah. So
it's interesting here. There's a kind of sop thrown to the animal rightists. Conscious life is the measure. And I wondered as I read this, I thought, well, gee, I wonder why he discriminates against non-conscious forms of life. The poor non-sentient creatures get kind of left out here. I mean, after all, there is a science of what contributes to the flourishing of corn, or there's a science of what contributes to the flourishing of slime molds or conches or slugs. They kind of get left out here. There's a science of what contributes to their flourishing, but that isn't defined to be part of the good. And I wondered, well, on what basis? Again, it seems there's a sort of speciesism going on here where one is simply adopting an unjustified bias toward one's own species.
So he's gone beyond man is the measure to sentient beings.
Sentient life is the measure.
We're privileged when we can get him. I'm curious, Bill, if we did an experiment in society for 20 years wherein we eliminated everyone over the age of 65, executed them, put them to sleep, and we saw a huge spike in quality of life as far as economics, less traffic, less healthcare cost, less burden on society and all this, and you saw this flourishing, this human flourishing all of a sudden. I think that Sam Harris would point to that and say, yeah, but these people over the age of 65 are humans and they're conscious, and we ought not do that.
I'm sure he would say that.
But if you just
the question is, doesn't his view impel one toward that conclusion? And I think, Kevin, here we begin to see the really sinister side of this view of the moral good. He says in the book that a piecemeal account is now emerging of how human beings flourish. And it immediately occurred to me, wouldn't this lead to eugenics?
Yes.
Where, in order to promote the flourishing of human beings, you would practice infanticide or abortion on any children that are born with physical deformities that are hereditary, which would have eliminated someone like me, for example, who has a genetic neuromuscular disease, as well as people with other sorts of handicaps. The vision of the eugenicist was to craft a kind of super race that would be free of all genetic defects and inherited diseases and would lead to this great flourishing of human beings at the relatively small cost of just eliminating these defective people. And so...
What a nightmare.
I think this is a very dark side to Sam Harris's ethic of human flourishing here.
This is what I think. I mean, if you're going to go by strictly scientific measurements, it's going to lead to all kinds of things like that. Eugenics and eliminating undesirables, quote unquote, and things like that.
Well, obese people, for example, and other sorts of undesirables would not contribute overall to human flourishing because it would promote more disease, more economic hardship on the rest of us, and so forth, as we have to support these people.
Stephen Hawking would be one of the first guys to go.
Oh, my goodness, yes. And there goes Hawking.
But he's right in line, it seems, with Peter Singer on a lot of things like this. He's very controversial. And I don't think he's that radical, or he's trying not to be. But what it seems to me, Bill, is that science may measure the results of certain actions. Suppose everybody in the community decided to be more loving. And we were actually able to see some spikes and peaks on a scientific graph. If we were to graph that somehow, that would only be a reflection of the moral activity that took place. So it can maybe science can measure certain things, but that doesn't determine.
Oh, I think we would. I see no objection whatsoever to developing a science of human flourishing as he wants to do. He seems to regard this as controversial, which is interesting. He admits we don't really have it yet. It's only piecemeal, but he's hoping that we can develop a science of what really contributes to human well-being. And that's great. I think that's fine, but I just don't see any moral dimension to that on atheism as to why that would be something that would be good. And quite the contrary, as your most recent remarks here have suggested, this is open to abuse in the most frightening of ways in that it could lead to kind of eugenics and end-of-life issues and so forth, that where you would justify moral atrocities in the name of human flourishing.
Again, it's a nightmare. Amazon asks Sam Harris, what do you think the role of religion is in determining human morality? His answer, I think it is generally an unhelpful one. Religious ideas about good and evil tend to focus on how to achieve well-being in the next life, and this makes them terrible guides to securing it in this one. Of course, there are a few gems to be found in every religious tradition, but insofar as these precepts are wise and useful, they are not, in principle, religious. You do not need to believe that the Bible was dictated by the Creator of the universe, or that Jesus Christ was His Son, to see the wisdom and utility of following the golden rule.
Yeah, that's a red herring.
Yeah.
Of course not. We don't think that you need to believe in God or Jesus in order to discern your moral duties or to realize that certain moral values are objective, like love and self-sacrifice for another and tolerance and so forth. And of course, that's not the argument. The argument that we're claiming is that in order to ground moral values and duties objectively, you need to have a transcendent source. They need to be grounded in God.
Well, once again, this has been an attempt to rescue morality from the religious realm and put it firmly in the secular realm. And it seems at the same time missing some issues along the way.
I think what it is it's one more example of how atheists blink when they stare into the face of atheism and see its consequences. So few modern atheists have the courage that Nietzsche had to look atheism in the face and understand the consequences of the death of God, and they cannot live with the sort of moral nihilism that results. And so you get these salvage operations which make gratuitous assumptions about the nature of the good and human flourishing, and therefore try to provide a kind of secular substitute for a religious foundation for morality.
Here's what an Amazon reviewer said, who's an atheist. He said, of course, a belief that makes people happy is no more likely to be true than one that makes people miserable. But if you're writing a book about the importance of well-being, the book is a conversation starter, to be sure. But by the time I got to the end, I was left with no real answers and with a feeling that Harris, like everyone else, is just frantically dog-paddling to escape the quagmire of moral emptiness that's forever sucking at our postmodern minds.
Wow.
While tipping an intellectual bow in its direction. Here's the point where a reluctant nihilist fails to find moral direction in science and has another beer.